everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In this first episode of 2022, we are going to talk about the Pacific Islands in the context of Indo-Pacific. My guest today is Cleo Paskal. Cleo Pascal's think tank affiliations include Associate Fellow, Chatham House, Royal Institute of International Affairs, London, UK, non-resident Senior Fellow for the Indo-Pacific Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Washington, D.C., International Board of Advisors, Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, India, and International Board of Advisors, Global Counterterrorism Council, India. She is widely published in the academic and popular press and lectures regularly to members of the defense community in a range of countries. Welcome, Cleo. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of the show, and especially the incredibly wide range of people that you bring on to talk about the region. It's been very helpful, so thank you.
You are welcome. Cleo, today, as I mentioned, our topic will be the Pacific Islands and in the context of Indo-Pacific. When we talk about the Pacific Islands, what do we mean?
So the Pacific Islands are the zone, the strategic zone, can also be called Oceania. And it's the zone that's broadly between Hawaii, although some include Hawaii in the Pacific Islands, Japan, and New Zealand. So it's a huge chunk of the Pacific Ocean. It's about 1/6 of the planet's surface. There are around 20 at least different kinds of countries. Some are independent, some are dependencies. Some have very specific sorts of relationships with a larger power, which we can talk about a little bit later. But it's a complex, dynamic zone that is the front line between Asia and the Americas. So when we talk about the Chinese Navy, for example, the Chinese, which is the point of the spear of Chinese military power, once it gets past that first island chain, which is sort of Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down, what it hits is the Pacific Islands. So the Pacific Islands is the strategic front line between Asia and the Americas, and it's what China needs to be able to have a foothold in, or at least be secure from a Chinese perspective, in order to be able to expand its naval power.
So, Cleo, what are some of the social, political, and the economic characteristics of the Pacific Islands?
So that's an interesting question, because when you talk about the Pacific Islands, often there isn't a big understanding of what it's like to live in those countries or to be from those countries. But it's a very different operational reality than many other places. So in many cases, some countries are bigger and different, like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, but in many cases, there's not a lot of land, there's a lot of water, and they're old and deep cultures, but they're also quite contained. So if you live in a place like Tonga, for example, which has a lot of different islands, but the whole population of the country is around 100,000 people, you walk down the street, at any time you can meet somebody you went to school with, somebody you dated, somebody you worked with, a relative. It's a very small, cohesive, tight types of community with old and deep relationships. So outside powers coming in, whether it's American, New Zealand, Australian, Chinese, whatever it is, can be very socially disruptive. The social capital is incredibly important in a lot of these places. These aren't countries that depend on usually the government to support them. They depend on the extended family to support them. Land ownership is in many cases communal or traditional. So if you privatize land ownership, then you disrupt the underpinning social welfare system. So, for example, during the pandemic, what we've seen is, again, in places like Tonga, tourism sector, which wasn't huge, but it was something, shut down, basically, obviously. And a lot of people, because they have these familial plots of land returned to the land and could grow food, and then they could exchange food with other family members who were doing fishing or whatnot. So it creates kind of a food security network because of the land ownership system, which is very different than Western style land ownership systems. So if the ADB, for example, the Asian Development Bank comes in, or China comes in, or Australia, New Zealand comes in and says, your land isn't productive, you need to privatize it. What it does is it could potentially disrupt the base of the social welfare network, which is something that we saw happen recently in Samoa, for example, which had political implications. So these countries function very differently, socially, economically, and politically than larger countries because of their small population size, their old and deep relationships to each other, and their small, in many cases, land size. So you can't just say if something works in, the Philippines or Canberra, it's going to work in Tonga or Samoa. You need to talk to the people and really understand how their structure and economy works in order to figure out whether something's going to be effective or disruptive.
So the Cleo, how the Pacific Islands come to the fore geostrategically? What is the geostrategic importance of these islands also?
Right. So this has to do with if you're talking strictly geostrategically, this is because of China. I mean, you know this very, very well. As an expert yourself in the South China Sea, East China Sea, you know how important islands are strategically. And so important that China has built islands in order to be able to project power in the South China Sea. Similarly, China took a very close look at what happened during World War II with Japan, and how Japan took islands in the Pacific, and the Americans, with obviously allies and the people from the countries, had to liberate them one by one in order to push Japan back. China is trying to accomplish the same thing, not through kinetic warfare, but through political warfare. So they're trying to gain enough political and economic control over these islands so that they effectively control them almost in the same way that Japan did during World War II, in order to push back the US, isolate Australia, New Zealand, and isolate Japan. So as the Chinese Communist Party goes for Taiwan, we tend to look at it coming off the coast of China. But at the same time, there's this buildup from behind Taiwan, from the second island chain, that could squeeze it from both sides. Same thing for Japan. It could squeeze and isolate Japan. Same thing for Australia. It could squeeze and isolate Australia. So getting political and economic control in the Pacific Islands is a strategic imperative for China's comprehensive national power expansion.
When we're talking about the engagement of the larger countries, which larger countries do you think are engaged with the Pacific, and in which way they try to engage these countries?
So we talked a little bit about the Chinese one, but and I would just say that the thing about China is the Chinese approach in the think tanks, in the Chinese think tanks, the question is, and this is again something you know very well, what is China's goal? And in the Chinese think tanks, what they talk about is comprehensive national power. They want China to be number one in the world in terms of comprehensive national power. And that is an empirical metric for the Chinese. So they calculate, for example, military power, economic power, but also a lot of other things like access to resources, human capital, intellectual property, and it's all numerical. And then they aggregate it into one number and say this country is this number in terms of comprehensive national power, this country is another one. And that's the way that China looks at engaging in other countries. How can it extract the maximum comprehensive national power for Beijing out of that engagement? So when it goes into a Pacific Island country, it'll look at its strategic value, its political value, but also its economic value. So, for example, it'll look at a place like the Solomon Islands, and it'll want to extract natural resources, but also political and strategic positioning. So that's why when you look across the Pacific and Pacific Island countries, China has these massive embassies in these very tiny countries because they don't look at the embassies as being just a toehold for diplomatic engagement. They look at it as being the entry point for so many other aspects of comprehensive national power for Chinese power projection. The U.S. has been throughout the U.S. Used to understand how important the area was, and is starting to again. I mean, again, a lot of Americans died trying to liberating the region, but after the end of the Cold War, they started to pull back, except for in the north where you've got Guam and the freely associated states, and they delegated a lot of the strategic oversight, as it's put, to Australia and New Zealand. Australia has been very good at standing up to China elsewhere, but in the Pacific Islands, there's been a lot of, I think it was a different group of people maybe making the decisions, and Australia and New Zealand have an odd relationship, and New Zealand is its own whole thing. But what you've seen is under their sort of watch from a Western perspective, strategic perspective, there's been a lot of Chinese gains. So countries like the Solomons and Kiribati switched from Taiwan to China in 2019. And that woke up a lot of people in Washington, London, and Paris saying, okay, maybe something's not working quite right in the region, and in Tokyo as well. So you're starting to see a lot more engagement from a lot of different players. Japan just announced, for example, it's going to reopen, or it's going to open an embassy in Kiribati. So there's a lot going on in the region right now, and we can identify the Chinese engagement. But if you're asking about the other countries, there are a lot of other countries doing a lot of other things, maybe more or less effectively.
Now, you mentioned about the China and the Taiwan situation in the region. Is the China-Taiwan issue just about the diplomatic recognition? For example, what's going on the Solomon Islands in this context?
Yeah, so I don't think so. I think that, and if you read what people in the region are saying about it, they don't think so either. It's a fight between systems. It's a fight between centralized authoritarian systems as represented by the Chinese Communist Party and systems that respect human rights and individual decision making. So, for example, in the Solomon Islands, as you mentioned, there's one province in the Solomons called Malaita Province, where soon after the switch from Taiwan to China, that provincial government put out the Auki communique. Auki is the capital of that province, where they said they didn't want to allow Chinese Communist Party linked businesses into their province. And they were very clear that one of the reasons was because they believe in freedom of religion, and they're very devout. They're Christian in that area. And they think that the Chinese Communist Party is aggressively atheist and anti-religion and persecutes people of faith within China. So they don't want to do business with the Chinese Communist Party. That has nothing to do with Taiwan. They just don't want to do business with a country that is that they view as being against some of their fundamental values. So Taiwan is, supporting Taiwan is a byproduct of having a whole system of beliefs and values that you're willing to stand up to China for. You're willing to stand up for those values. If you have those values, if you believe in individual rights and freedoms and freedom of worship and all that sort of stuff, then you're much more willing to say, we don't want to deal with China. And if you don't want to deal with China, your other option is, Taiwan and that. So it's not two equal things. It tells you a lot about the values and self-identity of the countries involved, what they believe in, and what they're willing to sacrifice for those beliefs, because the Chinese come in with a lot of money. So they're saying that these values for us, these values of our individual freedoms and rights, are more important to us than taking money from China.
Let me ask one question about the regional organizations. What are the regional organizations for the Pacific Island countries?
So This is a very timely question because there is a regional organization called the Pacific Island Forum, which contains the majority of the Pacific Islands plus Australia and New Zealand. Just under a year ago, there was a leadership contest for the leadership of the Pacific Island Forum, and the 5 Micronesian countries. So the Micronesia is the region to the north. It contains Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Kiribati, and Nauru. Those countries felt like they weren't being represented, and it was their turn to lead. They hadn't had a leader in a long time. And so they put forward an extremely good candidate, very qualified candidate. And there was a kind of an election, and it came down to a 1 vote difference. And Australia, New Zealand, and one of the French territories, which has a vote in it as well, all voted for somebody else. And that person won by 1 vote. So because especially those 3 big players rejected the Micronesian candidate, the Micronesians said, you know what, why are we here? We have a very small foreign policy community. It's expensive. We're not getting representation. It doesn't really make sense for us. And so they announced that they were withdrawing. So over the next few months, because you say you're withdrawing, then it takes a year for it to come into effect. Over the next few months, those 5 are going to be withdrawing. And they're going to be refocusing on the Micronesian Presidential Summit as a structure. So that's a structure that'll bring the 5 of them closer together. This has very large strategic implications because that zone consisting of those 5 countries is just beyond the first island chain. On 3 of those countries, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, have special agreements with the U.S. They're called Compacts of Free Association. And all 3 of them, for example, have a very high number of their nationals who serve in the U.S. military. And the U.S. military is responsible for their defense. So this is a zone that is much closer to the U.S. than the countries more to the south, the Polynesian and the Melanesian countries. And if they come together in a tighter unit, tighter, more focused unit, they have the ability to be quite important strategically, get their voice heard and be much more strategically important. The problem is that those 3 freely associated states, those compacts of free association are up for negotiation. And the U.S. Administration has been very slow at resolving the negotiations. Congress has sent bipartisan letters to the White House and the National Security Advisor saying, please sort this out, but it's been really, really slow. And as a result, Chinese influence has been trying to undermine those relationships. 3 of those 5 recognize Taiwan. China's been trying to get it to flip. So the longer the U.S. takes to resolve some of these outstanding issues, the more compromised their situation is, and the more time it gives China to get embedded and create more domestic problems, like they've done in the Solomon Islands.
Cleo, let me ask about one question related to this topic. What is the PACER plus trade agreement in this context?
Right. So the PACER plus trade agreement is a trade agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and several Pacific Island countries. Pacific Island countries have duty-free and tariff-free access into Australia and New Zealand already. But this deal was sort of pushed through by Australia and New Zealand to give Australia and New Zealand lower tariff access into Pacific Island economies. And I've asked a lot of people, and I have not been given a good idea. Nobody has been able to explain to me how this benefits Pacific Island countries. It seems to benefit Australia and New Zealand because it gives their goods and services preferential access into Pacific Islands. But even the bigger Pacific Islands said this makes no sense. So Papua New Guinea didn't sign on, Fiji didn't sign on, none of the US freely associated states signed on. All the countries that sort of had an alternative or a stronger negotiating team said, this is a very bad deal for us, why would we do it? But Australia and New Zealand pushed it through. And this gives a little bit of an insight into how China has advanced so well in the region. Because Australia and New Zealand have used their preferential position to push through policies that give them short-term economic advantage, but undermine the countries that they're dealing with, the Pacific Island countries that they're dealing with. I would argue to the point where they're more likely to take Chinese assistance. So, for example, in the case of PACER Plus, because it drops tariffs for Australian and New Zealand businesses, that means that those governments, which already don't have a lot of money, have even less money through tariffs, which means they're more likely to have to take Chinese loans. And I would expect Chinese companies, Chinese government-backed companies, would set up in Australia and New Zealand in order to gain preferential access into those Pacific Island economies and outcompete the domestic Australian and New Zealand businesses anyway. So to me, this is an extremely short-sighted kind of policy that thinks it's clever, but actually is very strategically destructive and very bad for Pacific Island economies, which again is why the bigger countries didn't sign on. But they're pushing through with it, and we'll see where it heads. But it's something that needs to be watched because it really is not good for the countries in the Pacific. And if you destabilize them economically, it opens the door. First of all, it's very bad for the people of the region, but second of all, it opens the door for malign influence to come in and be even more destabilizing.
And Cleo, do you think, what are some of the ways the Pacific Islands countries can amplify their concerns and gain the sort of partnership needed?
Yeah, so there are a few different things. One thing that's happened during the pandemic, which has been interesting, is that because foreign journalists can't just fly in and do their 3-minute talk to camera and then fly out again, there's been a lot more hearing from Pacific Island journalists themselves. So a lot of the coverage of the Solomon Islands, for example, has been done by Solomon Island journalists. And you're starting to get to actually hear some of the voices from the region through the media. I think what's also would be helpful is more support for research organizations. We did at Chatham House, we did a big Indo-Pacific study, and in Tonga, we partnered with a think tank in Tonga, which is run obviously by Tongans, and the research that they did was invaluable. It was something that we couldn't have understood otherwise. So, for example, when people talk about Tonga, they often talk about the big Chinese loan that they have. And what the Tongans said during the course of this research, people who understood the system, they said was, well, if we want to deal with the Chinese loan, all we have to do is, pay our taxes. But, and then we'd have enough money to pay off the loan. But they don't pay off the taxes, in part because they don't have a good automated taxation system. And a lot of the local businesses are run by recently arrived ethnic Chinese who don't pay taxes. So in order to deal with the Chinese loan situation and many other economic issues, what they actually need is a good automated taxation system. And then they would be able to extract the appropriate taxes from the locally run Chinese shops that would help to keep their economy going. So that's something that you can't have a fly-in consultant figure that out. You need to have partners on the ground from local think tanks explain the situation. So there's the journalism, there's the think tanks, and then there's also things like the regional organizations that were talked about, like the Micronesian Presidential Summit, where you don't have that layer of an Australia or New Zealand or France or US or somebody else muting the voice. You need to, however unpleasant the message is, you need to hear it so that you can figure out how to work together more effectively.
Now, the Cleo, we're talking about the China, US, Taiwan, and their involvement in the region. Let me ask a question about another countries, for example, the US, UK, France, and other regional countries, India and Japan, Indonesia's involvement. To what extent they are engaged to the Pacific Islands, these countries?
So they're all. So of the countries that you named, some are much more engaged than others. So I'd say Japan, for example, is very engaged. Japan has old ties to Micronesia. These are pre-war. This has kind of, if you look at Palau, Palau has 1,000 Japanese loan words in the language. There's a lot of exchange. There's a lot of goodwill. And Japan is opening a lot of diplomatic representation across the region, and they're very concerned because they know, from their own experience, how important the Pacific Islands are. So they see Chinese encroachment in the Pacific Islands, and strategically, they're very clear about what sort of a threat that is for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Similarly, France has territories in the region, very large territories. New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna. So they're physically in the region. And they're also, they're concerned. There is the independence referendum and its complications in New Caledonia. There's a lot going on in the French territories to do with China and the French position in the region. The British are starting to become much more interested. They also opened new diplomatic representation, I think in Tonga, Vanuatu, Samoa, I think. So they're also starting to get more engaged. I think that's more an attempt to part of a broader strategy to do with reinvigorating the Commonwealth relationships and maybe wider intelligence applications, through perhaps becoming more relevant to the Five Eyes in that way. Indonesia is quite is an interesting issue because because of West Papua, the West Papua situation. It is something that is very important to a lot of Pacific Island countries, and that is worth watching because that's quite a violent situation, and it pushes a lot of religious buttons. So there's a narrative that. About West Papua, about Christianity and Islam in the region and that sort of stuff, and so that is something that is developing and very contentious and very personal for a lot of people. Can't remember what other countries you mentioned, but
India.
That's a good one. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2016 went to Fiji and said that that they wanted to get much more involved in Pacific Island countries. And he did something that meant a lot to the people of the Pacific, which was he gave them visas on arrival for India. And visas and travel is something that's very, it's a contentious issue in the Pacific Islands, because if, for example, you want to go from Samoa to Australia or New Zealand, you have to go through quite a complex, expensive, and sometimes humiliating process for applying for a visa. And it's very personally insulting for many in the region, because they see this colonial country right next door, where they have their Maori cousins, and getting there is difficult and humiliating. And there were immigration raids that are in New Zealand that are still remembered, and there was slavery from Australia of Pacific Islanders that's still remembered. So when India says, "Come on in, you're welcome. We want you to come," that at a very personal level, that's quite important. The problem is, the flights in many cases run through Australia and New Zealand. So again, when I was in Tonga for that research trip, there was a university, somebody who runs a university in India, who wanted to come to Tonga to talk about maybe setting up a campus or something in Tonga. And she had to transit through New Zealand, and New Zealand held up her visa for so long that she couldn't get into Tonga to come for the meeting. So these issues of visas and transportation routes and things, can block even the best meaning policies coming out of India. So I think if India is sincere about engaging with the Pacific Islands, but its MEA, its Ministry of External Affairs, is overstretched. It isn't a priority area necessarily, and there are a lot of these structural impediments to creating the linkages. So it would take a bit more focus and a bit more engagement, maybe from the private sector in India, to jumpstart the process.
Thank you, Cleo. Now, there is a few questions from audiences I am going to bring on screen. Maybe you can give a comment. Yes, Andrea, what kind of strategies does the US have in the Pacific Islands to stop growing Chinese influence in the region? What will be your comment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are different areas, different political areas. So again, I'll talk about Micronesia, because that's the area where the U.S. is supposed to be the most active because of the three freely associated states. So when you talk about the U.S., there are many different U.S.s. So there's the military, there's Congress, there's the White House, there's that sort of thing. So in terms of the military, so Indo-Pacific, which is based out of Hawaii, there's a lot more talk about increasing basing in the area. So Palau offered base to the U.S., and that was a very brave move. In this climate, if you're the president of Palau, in this case, President Whips, and you offer a base to the U.S., you're putting a big target on your back. That means that the Chinese are going to fund everybody who's up against you politically, and they'll try to leak whatever they can or whatever. So he made a very big move by offering that base to the U.S. The U.S. has been kind of slow to respond, but in the just signed NDAA, the National Defense Appropriation Act, there is money for doing more of these bases. So we'll see whether something more than just the radar station comes up in Palau. There's also talk about something in the another base type thing in the Federated States of Micronesia. That's on the military side, and this is consistent with, for example, what the Commandant of the Marine Corps has said he wants to do with the repositioning of the Marines: smaller units, more dispersed. You need cooperation of the Pacific Islands to do that. Congress, as I mentioned, has been very bipartisan, supportive of the Pacific Islands. All sorts of engagement. They want more engagement with the Pacific Islands, but the administration has been somewhat slow to respond. So we'll see over the next few months whether the push from Congress, which is very laudable and consistent, will push some more action from the administration, especially on getting those compacts of free association sorted. I'd also say that this is sort of more for the Micronesian zone. For the southern zone, I think there is definitely an awareness that the U.S. needs to ramp up its diplomatic engagement. The Solomon Islands, where the U.S., the Australians have deployed, they have troops on the ground there now. The Chinese have said they're going to be sending in police advisors. This is the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal, one of the most brutal battles of World War II, where thousands of Americans died. There isn't an American embassy in the country. So I think there's an understanding that, it would be beneficial for the U.S. to have more embassies across the area. And that's, again, something that's being pushed by Congress.
Yes, Maria Tyler, can Pacific Islands protect their sovereignty amid U.S.-China competition in the region? This is about the sovereignty, I think.
Yeah, that's it. Again, that's a good question. There are the countries of the Pacific Island countries are they have very knowledgeable leadership. So these are countries that have been on the forefront of geopolitical contestation for 150 years. If you look at some of the countries in Micronesia, First, they belonged to Spain, then they belonged to Germany, then they belonged to Japan, then they belonged to the U.S., and finally they're independent. But the leaders that were there during all of those different periods, their descendants are still in the country. If you remember, as I mentioned right at the beginning, nobody goes away. They have deep, long memories. So they've been balancing outside powers for a very long time. And they have smart and skilled leadership. The difference this time between the colonial period is the large influx in some countries of newly arrived ethnic Chinese coming from China who only come into the country maybe for 5 or 6 years, make what money they can, and then leave. Those communities tend to bring in with them drugs, prostitution, gambling, through these small retail shops right into the local communities. So if you're talking about sovereignty, there's national sovereignty, national level sovereignty, but then there's also, your integrity as a society. And the integrity as a society is at risk in a way that it wasn't before, because of this kind of ground level importation of criminal activity that is new. But in terms of the balancing of powers, they've done it before. They're pretty strong and they're pretty good at it. So I wouldn't underestimate them.
Elizabeth Wilson, how can you evaluate the Pacific Islands in China's grand strategy?
Thank you. Yeah. So they are essential for projection of power. You can't. It's not just kind of what you can see. I mean, we know that they want the ports, they want air access. You saw with Kiribati, for example, Kiribati switched in 2019 from Taiwan to China, and now China's talking about rehabilitating an old World War II U.S. Landing strip on a very remote island for tourism purposes. I mean, there's no tourism out there, but it's a very important strategic location. So we know about that. That's kind of the visible component of it. But then these islands are also key nodes in some cases of landing spots for undersea cables. They're also very important for geostationary satellites. They're kind of the front line, really, in any contestation between the Americas and Asia. We've seen it before that way. So they are having, if not control, then the ability to deny access to other powers, not just U.S. but also Japanese. And I think it's really important to show. This is why the Quad is important. This isn't just China versus the U.S. If you care about freedom of the seas, this area needs to remain free. Freedom of the seas. And that's why the Quad is implicated. That's why the India component is interesting. Because, as mentioned, because this comprehensive national power push, the way that China comes in initially usually is economically. And the West can't compete economically with China. The goods are too expensive, but India can compete. So if instead of bringing in cheap Chinese pharmaceuticals, they're bringing in the affordable Indian pharmaceuticals, which are probably more reliable anyway, then you can actually start to give the countries a little bit more economic breathing space. So if you're talking about how they fit into China's grand strategy, and you see that the initial entry point is economic, which has a strategic component, and then usually criminal activity overtones, then you can see that if you can give an alternative for the economic component, which is mostly viable through India or Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines, any other similar economic structure, then you can start to push back on some of the strategic positioning of China.
I have two more. What is the best strategy for minimizing CCP influence in the Pacific Islands, and what more can Australia do? Derek Shaw.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so one thing that would be very helpful for the Australians, and it started to happen a little bit with the Solomon Islands thing, we'll use the Solomon Islands as a case study, is just to give some media coverage to what's going on, and especially to corrupt activity. So in the case of the Solomon Islands, it is clear that Prime Minister Sugavari is corrupt. I mean, I'm not, if you can talk to Transparency International in the country, he didn't hide it. They got Chinese money, and they gave the Chinese money to 39 out of the 50 members of parliament. The 39 just happened to be the ones that supported him, and the 11 ones who didn't support him didn't get the money. I mean, it's very overt. And in many cases, these guys are laundering their money through Australia, or they have assets in Australia. So just kind of the thing that corrupt activity hates sunlight, right? Sunlight is the great disinfectant. If you start to cover it, if you start to write about it, then you make it much more difficult for them to get away with what they're getting away with. And you give room for the honest leaders, and there are a lot of honest, brave leaders in the Pacific who just want a chance. But because they're honest, they don't have the money to buy the local newspapers or whatever to gain coverage. So in that respect, Australia can be very helpful. So you've got, first of all, you give it more coverage, and I'd say Ben Peckham from the Australian has been doing some very good coverage on this. But also you can start to look at things like disproportionate assets, because again, they hide a lot of their money in Australia. If you let Chinese money to corrupt politicians in the Pacific Islands be hidden in Australia, you are complicit. So, if you want to push back and you want to truly do the things that Australia says it cares about in terms of democracy, transparency, and accountability, don't let them hide the money in Australia or New Zealand. So there's that sort of thing would be incredibly helpful. And specifically in the case of the Solomon Islands, the Townsville Peace Agreement of 2000 is a way forward. Ramsey, even throughout the years of Ramsey, it was never properly implemented. Had it been properly implemented, it would have been much more difficult for China to do what it's done in terms of creating divisions within the country. So before Australia leaves, it would be very helpful for the Solomon Islands if they enabled a process where, especially Part 4, the Townsville Peace Agreement was enacted. That's a way for creating stability and security going forward. Not the troops on the ground, but listening to what the people, the locals have said they need in order to be able to go forward with a peaceful resolution, peaceful, enduring, sustainable resolution to the problem.
Andrea, I have last two questions. I just bring on the screen. Andrea Smith, what is the strategic importance of the Pacific Islands in the Indo-Pacific concept?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, these are great questions. So the Pacific Islands they're huge. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I have a question. Malaysia, when you have a map of the world, what is in the center of the map?
I think every country put themselves into the center.
Okay, so if Malaysia's in the center, then you know what the Pacific looks like, right? In the West, we tend to, like you said, North America or Europe is in the center of the map, so the Pacific is cut at both sides. So you don't get a sense of how central it is to the world, right? Or especially to the Indo-Pacific. But if you have a Pacific-centered map, Indo-Pacific centered map, then you see like half of that is the Pacific Islands. And the Pacific Islands is what you get between the Americas and Asia. So unless that zone is secure, and they're small islands, but because of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, every island gets a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around that island. So these are actually, they cover a lot of the land. So Kiribati, as mentioned, has about 100,000 people in it, but every island gets 200 nautical miles. So it covers as much of the planet as India does, right? These are large, strategically important locations. And if you don't have if the Pacific Islands isn't part of a free and open Indo-Pacific where you have freedom of navigation and all that sort of stuff, your zone is a mess. So it is essential for any of the countries anywhere around the Indo-Pacific periphery to ensure that that zone, the Pacific Island zone, Oceania, is free and open and stable and secure and ideally prosperous, and you can hear what they're saying so that you can help them accomplish that.
I think Cleo, I think the Pacific countries need a spatial map since the size of the country is very small. We cannot even I think the half of population of the world not aware the place, the location of the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, you're right. Maps are really important, right? I mean, once you actually start looking at the Indo-Pacific and you start seeing those islands, then you can see how important they are. And one way of doing that, if anybody is interested, is take a look at a map of the Pacific theater in World War II. And you'll see all of those islands, one by one.
Need to detailed maps. I just used one to the cover poster is detailed map, but when we look at the Google Earth or another maps, we cannot easily find all the Pacific Islands countries. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question, parallel. Is France going to push the EU's foreign policy into the Pacific Islands and the Indo-Pacific during the 2022 presidency?
So that's a good question. So France is complicated. So France, yes. So yes, France has been one of the driving forces in encouraging the EU to have an Indo-Pacific foreign policy. And in fact, I think the same day that the EU announced its Indo-Pacific policy was the day that Australia said it was getting rid of the French subs and joining AUKUS. So, which gives it kind of in a sense, gives you an idea of France in the Pacific, because yes, France as part of the EU, and this is a bigger question about how the individual component parts of the EU function in terms of independent foreign policies. So France, yes, is pushing Indo-Pacific in terms of the EU, but France also has its own very strong Indo-Pacific engagement, and it's built economically around defense, energy, and infrastructure. And it has old and deep relationships with countries like India, for example. The India-France space scientific cooperation around space goes back to the 60s, and it doesn't want to share that. That's a kind of a political capital that it's developed over time, and relationships that's developed over time that it doesn't want to share with the Germans or anybody else. So at the same time as it's pushing this kind of top level Indo-Pacific policy for the EU, it will pursue its own interests in the region. And its interests are complex, and they're not necessarily congruent with larger Western interests. So, for example, when AUKUS was signed, one of the first things Macron did was call up Modi in India and say, see, you can't trust these Anglo-Saxons, they'll stab you in the back, you need strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy means buying French weapons. Okay, so if what you're really concerned about is pushing back against China, then you should actually be happy for AUKUS, because those French subs will be defending New Caledonia, French possession, as much as they will be Australia. They will be, in fact, AUKUS will be Australia taking on an economic commitment and a strategic commitment to defend that area of the Pacific, which benefits the French. But it doesn't benefit the French defense sector. So the question about France is going to be, at some point, whether it's more concerned about China strategically than it is concerned about its own economic interests in the region. That's the balance that France is going to have to play out. And I think for the foreseeable future, they're going to have to put their own economic interests before they put kind of a pushback against China in place.
The Cleo, we already come to the end of our question. Before we go to the end, I will ask the last questions for your predictions. What will be your predictions for the Pacific Islands? Do you think that the Pacific Island countries will be a zone or area of competition for the great powers or the superpowers?
Yeah, so my biggest concern about the Pacific Islands is the sort of destabilization that you're seeing in the Solomon Islands happens in other countries as well. So my concern is that that the Quad doesn't get involved. Australia, New Zealand, the US, Japan, India don't engage the Pacific Island countries in a way that creates the sort of stability that they need in order to withstand what's happening at the same time, which is China actively getting involved in countries and creating divisions so that they can back an authoritarian leadership and then make that authoritarian leadership more dependent on them. So China goes from kind of goodwill to support to dependency. So it benefits China to destabilize countries so that authoritarian leadership comes to the fore, and that authoritarian leadership becomes more dependent on Beijing, which is exactly what we saw in the Solomons. Sogavari now has brought in the Chinese police, and who knows what other sorts of probably intel or whatever he's getting from the Chinese in order to consolidate his hold on power. So it benefits China to create instability within Pacific Island countries so that those authoritarian leaders turn to Beijing. So my concern is that there isn't enough of an understanding of the urgency of the situation from the powers who claim that they are defending or they want to defend democracy, transparency, accountability, and in the process, China creates hell in the countries of the Pacific for the people of the Pacific. So it's not a projection, it's a concern. And I don't think it's decided either way. But unless action is taken, and these are small countries, it doesn't have to be, they don't need a lot. Malaysia can be helpful. Philippines can be helpful. A lot of different countries can get involved and make a big difference for these countries. But right now they're facing a situation where there is an active attempt to destabilize them coming out of Beijing for Beijing's own strategic interests. And I find that extremely concerning.
Cleo, in this regard, I would like to make a small comment. This division currently we see in the Pacific Islands, or competition between the US and China to make an influence in the Pacific Islands. It is the first time we see this. We saw the division in Pacific Islands, or when we look at the history, for example, during the Cold War or during the Japan Empire. Is there any division or?
So what happens is, what the Chinese do is they find existing divisions, subnational divisions, and then exacerbate them. But I would say at a macro level, throughout the colonial period, colonial powers were very good at backing one side against another side, and that part of it certainly isn't new. This is the divide and conquer. I think it goes in Western culture. It goes back to the Greeks, and I'm sure it's pretty standard across the board. But we haven't seen kind of this level. I'd say the only comparison might be kind of the religious conversion period during the colonial period, where you had kind of religious groups fighting for power within a country across the Pacific. But this is, sort of at a political and economic level, incredibly destabilizing. And just because it happened before, it was bad that happened before. I'm not sure that we should let it happen again. Just because somebody made a mistake before doesn't mean that you should let it happen a second time. I would hope we would learn from our mistakes and that people in the region wouldn't have to suffer a second time around.
Okay, Cleo, thank you very much. I hope that these shows will be the most detailed shows about Pacific Islands on the YouTube.
You're very, very patient. Thank you for your interest and for your time. And if anybody wants more information, I am actually happy to talk about this more or spread more information or put you in touch with people in the Pacific Islands who know the topic much better than I do, who can help. I think that the situation is quite urgent, and the more people talking and thinking about it, the better. So thank you.
You're welcome. The shows will be archived on my YouTube channel, and people can watching for forever. I think just our difficulties we encounter to the difficulties of the time zone. I think that many of most of my audiences currently are sleeping in different countries. When they are wake up, I think they will watch too.
Well, thank you for accommodating me in my peculiar time zone. I appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome, and also thank you for my audiences for these terrific questions. Yes. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for upcoming shows about Asia and Pacific region or Indo-Pacific region. Hope we can see in the next shows. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you.